Well, good evening, everyone, and can I be the first one to welcome you along to the University of Glasgow's Advanced Research Centre for tonight's lecture. I'm Graham Roy, and I'm Dean of External Engagement in the College of Social Sciences at the University of Glasgow. And it's my real pleasure to see so many people here tonight for what is going to be a fantastic event. 2023 is the tercentenary of the birth of Adam Smith, and over the course of the year we've got a fantastic set of activities taking place, and this week is a truly special series of events. Most alumni and most famous professor here at the university. For this work, we are doing a series of activities throughout the year, and we're delighted to have the very generous support of the John Templeton Foundation for this work, and Greg from the Foundation is here tonight somewhere. There he is. Greg, thank you very much for all your support for this. And we're doing a series of activities which you'll hear about in a moment. But one of the key things for that is the Templeton Fellows Lectures, where this is the first one in the series, and we're having several of them throughout the year. And the key intellectual lead behind the tercentenary here at the University of Glasgow is Craig Smith, who will be familiar to many of you for his work on Adam Smith, his writings. He's the incoming editor of the Adam Smith Review, and he's been the key intellectual innovator behind everything that we're trying to do for the tercentenary this year. And
occasions around the world, operating and working with partners to spread the word of Adam Smith as wide as we can in the year of his birthday. I should, of course, start with my usual disclaimer. I'm Craig Smith. I'm the Adam Smith Lecturer in the Scottish Enlightenment here at the University of Glasgow. I am no relation to Adam Smith. I am Scottish and called Smith, so make of that what you will. So I'm delighted to welcome this evening our distinguished guest professor Deirdre Nansen McCloskey, who's going to speak this evening to us on Smith's relationship to liberalism, and Smith being the first liberal, which is a wonderful topic. And it's particularly appropriate that we do this here at the University of Glasgow, which is Smith's intellectual home. So Smith was a student here, he was a professor here, he worked on the material that would become the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations here. So it's the ideal place for us to kick off this series of lectures. And as Graham said, it's part of a wider project that we're engaged in this year to celebrate Adam Smith's tercentenary. And we've called it Smith at 300, celebrating Adam Smith as a scholar, an educator and a citizen. And what we really want to do is to get more people interested and engaged with Adam Smith's ideas. So we're looking at each of these different elements of Smith. We're exploring new research on Smith as an academic, on Smith's library, on his marginalia, with the generous support of the John Templeton Foundation. And we have our postdoctoral fellows who are in place to assist with the project. Both them, Leo and Anna, are here tonight. So they'll be working with us over the next 2 years, furthering their own research on Adam Smith, but also assisting in the project. So an academic element to it, a Smith studies element to it. But we want to take Smith out of the academic setting and get people interested in him. So one of the things that we've been doing over the last 8 weeks is running online global reading groups on the Wealth of Nations, where people could join us, and it was a very successful series of events. You could sign up for a website and then join me every Thursday to talk about Adam Smith. So that was a great pleasure for me for that. And we had some really fun conversations, interesting conversations with people from all around the world and different backgrounds. And I think that's something that we're really keen to explore as part of this project, to take Smith into conversations that we are having about the issues that we all face today. And that's the citizen strand that we have. And part of the citizen strand is not just trying to engage the public and get them interested in reading Adam Smith and thinking about him, but also bringing Smith into conversation, as I said, with the issues that preoccupy us today, to show Smith's relevance, to show that we can read his work, engage with his ideas, think about him, and through that, improve our own thinking about the world. And that's really the spirit that we hope is behind all of these events that will run through the year. So as I said, this is the first in a series of 8 lectures where we have distinguished Templeton Adam Smith Fellows who will speak to audiences like this around the world and give their opinions on Smith and Smith's ideas and relevance. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Professor McCloskey, who I think is a representative of the Smithian spirit of inquiry. So Professor McCloskey is the Distinguished Professor Emerita of Economics and of History and Professor Emerita of English and of Communication at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's a distinguished scholar and Isaiah Berlin Chair in Liberal Thought. That's nearly as good as the Adam Smith Lecture in the Scottish Enlightenment at the Cato Institute. Professor McCloskey's had a long and distinguished academic career. She took a PhD in economics at Harvard and taught at the University of Chicago and the University of Iowa before joining the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's written 24 books and some 400 academic and popular articles on economic theory, economic history, philosophy, rhetoric, statistical theory, feminism, ethics, and the law. The range of her research and her interests is suitably Smithian in its scope. So I think she's an ideal person to talk to us today about Adam Smith and to deliver this inaugural lecture. So with this unique mixture of economics, philosophy, history, politics, Deirdre McCloskey is absolutely ideal. So Deirdre, I'd like to invite you to address us all on the inaugural Templeton Adam Smith Fellow Lecture.
Thank you so much. Well, to say that I'm glad to be here is an understatement, and I'm ecstatic to be here. I just, when I mention Adam Smith, as I often do, I'm an Anglican, so I always cross myself. He was some sort of saint. But there's a problem in Adam Smith's studies. We don't know as much about him as we know about Kant or John Stuart Mill. There's not as much correspondence, not as many books. He only wrote 2 books, at least published books. So he would not be, he wouldn't get tenure in many departments of whatever he did. He was a moral philosopher, it's to be understood, at this university. That's what he taught. Therefore, one can put on Smith what you want, and that's a danger. The Freudians call it projection, and you can make Smith what you want. I was a friend of Bob Heilbrunner, a Marxoid, so to speak, a splendid man, and he, like lots of my friends on the left, put Adam Smith on the left and emphasized my dear friend and colleague, Fleischacker at the University of Illinois at Chicago, philosopher, He's a man of the left, and he puts him on the left. And then you can put him on the right. But I don't think this spectrum of left to right, which dominates most of our thinking about politics, can correctly characterize Adam Smith, or indeed lots of other people who call themselves liberals, or more exactly classical liberals, as I certainly do. The standard spectrum, which people want to keep forcing everyone onto, oh, I see your center left, and your left center, and your left, and it's all slightly mad. It's a kind of identity politics imposed on people. And more fundamentally, I think, it is an obstacle to thinking clearly about what the role of the state should be. Because on both the left and the right and the center, the state is to be enormous. It's to be like the Scottish state or the UK, taking over 50% of marketed national product for its purposes and regulating much of the left. I've taught some in Sweden, and when I was there, a hilarious episode occurred. You know, I love Sweden and admire it, but some functionary in the Department of Health felt it was her job to specify how much toothpaste you should put on your toothbrush. And even the Swedes found this ridiculous. And there was a great laughter arose from the Swedish press. You know, put 2 centimeters exactly on your brush. So we liberals, and Adam Smith, I would claim, wanted a competent government, an honest one, but smallish. One that could do the crucial jobs of national defense and then the local governments, such as he was the beneficiary of in his hometown, of elementary education. Scottish elementary education, of course, was vastly superior to that in England. So in the 18th century was higher education, for that matter. So he was a liberal. He was in favor, as he famously said, strongly in favor of the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. Now, by that he meant liberty of permission. He was an egalitarian. In Scotland, I think, Adam Smith is, along with this notion of the spectrum, is placed firmly on the right and is scorned as a Tory, which is truly what he was not. For his time, he was a radical egalitarian. He was firmly against slavery, as so many of the so-called founding fathers of my country were not. Thomas Jefferson, all men are created equal except my slaves and all women. Aside from that, you're created equal. Adam Smith believed deeply that people were created equal. Indeed, he's more of a Christian than is, I think, usually appreciated. He certainly existed in a, so to speak, liberal theological environment in his intellectual companions in life. He was on friendly terms. He was on friendly terms with everyone. The only prominent person who quarreled with Adam Smith is Rousseau, who quarreled with everyone. So that's sort of not a test. So he was a deeply egalitarian man. Now, it was not an equality of final outcome. That's Rousseau and the French Enlightenment. That's the dream of equality of incomes. This land, this glorious paradise in which we'll all be equal in outcome. We'll all be as rich as each other. We won't have football players or singers earning 30 times the average national income, or 40 or 50, or CEOs in my country earning 200 times the average income. We'll all be equal. That's not his ideal. He didn't preach against it necessarily. Well, he certainly, let's not get into that. But not equality of outcome, not equality at the finish line. He was, although a wonderfully, what would you say, academic man, but he was a man of the world too, in an odd way. He had merchant friends, famously in Glasgow, and he was clubbable. He was certainly he was like his friend David Hume. He was clubbable, amiable, as Jane Austen would say. So it was not equality at the finish line, nor indeed was it equality at the starting line. The easy and generous and good desire we have is that people be equal in opportunity. And this is a deeply held feeling many have. I have it myself. I wish people were equal at the starting line. As an economist, I point out, as any competent economist would, that radical egalitarianism at the finish line is a disaster for the economy. Then we have equality of poverty. But we get very small numbers of brain surgeons that way. But it's admirable and noble to want there to be equality of opportunity. I certainly want it. But the trouble is we can't have it. And as an economist, though I'm, as you point out, I've done a few other things, but as an economist, I believe in living in the real world. And understand. But that's the trouble. Some of us had excellent parents. I hope everyone here had excellent parents. But I doubt it. I'll bet you some of us had parents who beat us, parents who neglected us or discouraged us. And yet we came to have an intellectual life and somehow survived it, but still, it's not equality at the starting line. It's desirable, and I'm very willing to, even as a classical liberal, what I would regard as an Adam Smithian liberal, to provide for the kinds of public schools that Smith himself was the beneficiary of, and help out my fellow citizens. Indeed, as he pointed out, there's a problem with it just being the local citizens. As he said, it's only a vivid sense of justice that makes us feel for the Chinese as much as the loss of our little finger. He said, if we chop our little finger off when executing a local hen to eat, we accidentally cut our little finger off, we suffer more real pain than if the whole race of Chinese, he said, were to be swallowed up by the I don't know, some terrible earthquake. But he said, it's only this separate and distinct, it's not love, but a separate sense of justice that would make us ashamed to prefer our little finger to the whole race of the Chinese. So there's a problem of cosmopolitanism in saying, well, I want vigorous redistribution to fix the inequalities of the starting line within Scotland. Well, why within Scotland? Why not the race of Chinese, for instance? So my claim is that what Adam Smith, and by the way, he was I said that he was against slavery. Another hero of mine, our own Benjamin Franklin, somewhat surprisingly, owned slaves. This is in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. He brought a couple of slaves to his long sojourn in London, where he was a representative of the state of Pennsylvania, and then again, for that period, the state of Pennsylvania. One of the slaves ran away, as was perfectly legal in England at the time, and the other, these were two men, the other stayed with him, like Ruth and the Alien Corn. So even the best of our founding fathers wasn't as egalitarian as Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote eloquently against the growth of, this is quite shocking to people, mine slavery in the south of Scotland. This was developing in Adam Smith's life, and he railed against it. So it was not equality at the starting line or the finish line. It was the right of equal permission. Permitting women to be airline pilots. Permitting women and blacks to go to university. One of my 3 universities was the University of Iowa. Go Hawks, if that means anyone to hear. When it was founded in the 1840s, a frontier university, common enough in the United States, it admitted blacks and on equal terms to white men into the college. So that equality of permission, you're allowed to set up as a carpenter and don't have to have the approval of the Carpenters Guild. I'm sure I'm the only person in this room who could become, if this academic thing doesn't work out, an apprentice electrician in the state of Michigan. Is there anyone else who could do that? I could, and the reason I could is that my grandfather and my Uncle Joe, my cousin Phil, were all union electricians in the state of Michigan. And that's the only way you become an apprentice electrician in the state of Michigan. It's a closed shop. To be an electrician legally, you have to be a member of the union. And the only way you get into the union, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but none of you are qualified. Sorry, too bad for you. That kind of permissionless is to go. Now, thinking of Smith this way, I think, is correct from the point of view of the text and of what he wrote and thought. But it's also, as public policy, to come to your point about bringing Smith to the present, it's achievable. As I said, equality at the finish line is a disaster. That's pretty easy to show. By the way, this point about which equality works doesn't apply to families and friends. As Adam Smith himself pointed out in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, his greatest book, in my opinion, we love our families and our friends in a widening circle. Then our love gives out, and our sense of justice has to take over. So it's this wide, now within a group of family or friends, equality of outcome is completely natural. If I bring a pizza, big pizza, I pay for the pizza, bring pizza to the party, I say, well, I paid for it, so I'm going to eat it all. I won't have any friends. Or if I say, I'll sell you a piece. What am I bid for a slice of pizza? Whereas with strangers, no one objects. I'm not going to try to eat pizza in Glasgow. I come from Chicago and Boston. I'm not going to. I spent 3 weeks in Germany some years ago and kept having pizza attacks and said, well, there are lots of Italian and Germans. Surely there's good pizza in Germany, and there's not. So, haggis or something I'll have here, but not pizza. So, making my jokes, I'm losing the train here. So this equality of permission is practical in a way that the others are not, and can be achieved today as much as Adam Smith wanted it to be achieved in the 18th century. He famously says, I can't quote it exactly, surely you can, it is the impertinence, I think is the word he uses, of kings and counselors to pretend to be able to administer the affairs of their subjects, to tell them how much toothpaste to put on the toothbrush. And it's foolish. So true liberalism, like true Christianity, I've just finished a book called The True Liberal Christian. No, which way is it? No, The True Christian Liberal. I keep changing the title, so I keep forgetting. The True Christian Liberal Public Theology for an Age of Innovism, in which I argue this point at some length. A true liberalism is equality of permission. Now, one can say, so what? That's always the best question to ask, and this is a hint to the young people here who haven't been around the block academically, as I have. The best question you can ask in a seminar is, well, so what? You don't have to know anything. You don't have to have an answer. You just say, so what? And the person is is put on, as we say in cricket, on her back foot, and can't make as many shots as she could if she could go for it. Let's not. I'm in Scotland. I'm not in England. So what? Well, a great deal. It is liberty of permission that made the modern world, is my claim this afternoon. Tomorrow I'm going to have an detailed academic seminar in which I'm going to go into this in some detail. But here's the outline of the argument, or the core of the argument. This notion that people should have equal rights to join the race, though time and chance happeneth to us all, is specifically 18th century, and specifically Northwest European, including Holland, and most specifically Scottish, and most particularly Glaswegian. It's a new idea because it's contrary to the economically and politically inevitable hierarchies of agricultural societies. Hunter-gatherer societies are, in a sense, liberal. We think of them as having chiefs and the alpha male and so forth, but that's not actually the case of small hunter-gatherer bands. Larger clans do have chiefs, but not hunter-gatherer bands. If you don't like it, you can throw a rock at the tyrant or leave. But agricultural societies, as Rousseau pointed out, you're fixed. And a man with a sword and a horse can say, "So sorry, this is my land now, and you pay rents to me. If you don't like it, I'm going to chop off your head." So hierarchy was naturalized. And indeed, conservatives, these people on the right side of this spectrum, believe in naturalized hierarchies of that character. They glory in them. As Edmund Burke, there's a statue of Edmund Burke about a block from my office in Washington. And Edmund Burke believed that this egalitarianism of permission meant that the age of economists and calculators is upon us, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever, said he. Well, that's a traditional conservative view. Smith didn't believe it, although he worked for dukes and was skilled in the performance of hierarchy, your obedient servant, Adam Smith, and all that. So the result of the coming of this idea, I needn't tell most of this audience that it took a long while for Adam Smith's ideas to get a purchase on the mind of Britain or the United States or France. And it was in the early 18th century that it did, in the early 19th century that it did, to the extent it did. But what it wasn't, what Adam Smith isn't, is what came to be called in Britain in the 1880s a new liberal. New liberals believed in the power of the state to do good. Adam Smith was a realist. The Hanoverian state was not organized to do good for people. It was organized for the glory of the nation, most particularly the king. It was hierarchical, it was aristocratic, it had bourgeois elements. The bourgeoisie is naturally egalitarian, yet still it was ruthless, and the fist. Criminal law in the 18th century is the old example of this. But there grew up in the 19th century this notion that a nation by, of, and for the people would be nice. And this was the central conviction, which we still hold, most of us do, of the new liberalism that resulted eventually in the Liberal Party in Britain, and the Labour Party, and now, for that matter, the Tories, who believe, and I'm quite struck by that. Every time I come to Britain, I'm quite struck at the journalistic convention that's stronger here than in my country, which is, if there's something wrong, why doesn't the government do something about it? And that's a deep rhetorical convention in British journalism, including Scottish. All right. So this equality of permission was taken up slowly. I mean, look, my own country was still a slave society, hardly a perfectly liberal community. Women couldn't vote. Interestingly, in the United States, they first got their votes in state elections in the West. Not in the East, but in the West. In the new states of the Great Plains in the far West. So, it's slow. It develops. But eventually even blacks and women get liberated. Gay people, transgendered people, although in both Britain and the United States, Britain from the left, United States from the right, transgendered people are being systematically demonized. My friend Kathleen Stock is one of the demonizers, but I think highly of her. Feeling free to have a go. This is something that Tocqueville noticed about Britain. He said, this is in the 1840s, when I see Britain, when I see in Britain the spirit of, he didn't use this word, but enterprise and having a go that's permitted in Britain, as in France with its centralization, it wasn't. I'm less interested in how God arranged to have coal in Britain or excellent ports. That's not the key, said he. The key is the customs of the people. Moeurs, he said in French. That's what's important. And I'm saying the same thing. I'm saying that this new custom of equality of permission inspirited people, made them bold to have a go. By the way, this have a go talk, as you know, is a sporting metaphor. The British have invented more sports than any nation on earth. From golf, wisely defined as a game in which the object is to put a small ball in a distant hole with instruments ill-designed for the purpose. And cricket and organized football and rugby and therefore American football and blah, blah, blah. So the have a go talk is not inconsequentially, I think, a sporting metaphor and idea. They say in Australia, they've got a version of it, fair goes. Fair goes. And they're fierce about it in Australia. Fair goes. And the consequence, I argue, in a number of books, is a gigantic economic explosion. Innovation. I mean, look around this room. The back wall is glass. You couldn't do that glass until after the Second World War. It was just the float process and so on hadn't been invented. And you couldn't do glass that you could use as a wall. You could lean against that. Some people over there are leaning against the glass there. If you tried that in the 18th century, the 19th, even the 19th, you'd go right through it. And it's not just in technologies, in machinery and biology, but also in organization. That we, I guess we can say we, but anyway, the humans have gigantically innovated since 1800. Before that, humans innovated, but slowly. And so slowly that Malthusian mechanisms overcame repeatedly the innovations. The windmill was invented in the Arab world, passed to Spain famously, and Holland and so forth, and England. But slowly enough that its advantage, which was considerable in grinding grain and pumping water, didn't overcome diminishing returns to the population growth, thereby encouraged. So until 1800, the average person on the planet earned in modern Glaswegian terms, modern prices in Glasgow, $2 a day. Imagine living on $2 a day. It's very tough. There are some people in the world who still do. In 1960, 4 out of 5 people on the planet earned that, $2 a day on average. Now, 1 out of the 8 billion on the planet still are in such horrible misery. Zimbabwe and South Sudan and so forth. But 7 of the 8 billion have moved up to the global average, which is now $50 a day. To fix ideas, it's the average income today of the average person in Brazil. In Britain, it's easily 2.5 times that. In the United States, about 3 times that. But the average is about 50 as against 2, correcting for inflation, et cetera, et cetera. So this great enrichment, as I call it, the phrase the Industrial Revolution is misleading and scientifically inadequate. So I call it the great enrichment, is unique to the modern world and comes from liberty of permission. That's my claim. The nature and causes of the wealth of nations is liberty. So Adam Smith's economics ties into this great question of how we got so rich. It answers it, I claim. Now, there are other answers that economists and calculators have proposed. Adam Smith himself believed it was the division of labor. And I'm an economist. I believe in free trade. I love the division of labor. And Isn't it great? I bought this wonderful shawl here in Glasgow. I bought this here. I couldn't make these myself. Someone else made them and sold them for a price that I could handle. And so it's great. It's a good thing. But it doesn't explain a factor of 25. It doesn't explain a 2,500% increase. It might explain 100%. That's very good, a doubling. But not the order of magnitude of actual economic growth. And the other explanations on the left, on the right, the explanation is investment. You think, well, sure, of course it's investment. Look at this room. People had to pay for it. No. The problem is that investment, that is capital accumulation, has sharply diminishing returns if it's not about innovation. If there's not some new way of doing things, and this can be small as opening a new hairdressing salon in the neighborhood, or as large as James Watt, a separate condenser for the steam engine. Unless there's a reason to invest, the diminishing returns are very sharp. Suppose you have a car, one auto, and then you get another. Well, it's nice. Now your husband can drive to work too. But what about a third car, or a fourth, or a fifth? And they end up as junk on your front garden. There are diminishing returns to sheer investment. So that's the argument from the right. On the left, the argument is exploitation. Europeans are rich because the third world is poor. And that's equally doubtful, not just doubtful, implausible. Slavery for example, didn't cause the modern world. There have been slave societies in every corner of the world, including prominently Africa itself, which didn't result in modern economic growth. So that's the consequence. I'll stop here. The answer to the question, so what, is that contrary to what Smith himself believed, and which most economists in his train believed until relatively recently, efficiency, the division of labor, investment, maybe stealing something from the Indians, both South Asians and North American Indians, South American too, but that's what made us rich. And that's mistaken. Smith didn't know that his great idea of equality of permission was going to lead to the enrichment of every person in this room compared to their ancestors. I take it there, no. I look around, I don't see any Habsburg chins. I can't, maybe there's a descendant of the crowned heads of Europe, Asia, or Africa here. I don't think so. I think everyone here is a descendant of an unspeakably poor peasant. My own Irish and Norwegian, English, mainly Irish. And yet here we are. We owe this to the Scottish Enlightenment, the Glaswegian Enlightenment, you could call it, although Edinburgh became its center. We owe it to the idea of equality of permission. In other words, liberty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. That was wonderful. And also, probably just as well you didn't try to order pizza in Glasgow because we deep fry it.
Oh, Jesus. I'll tell you, I have a friend in Edinburgh, who's a playwright, and I insisted that she take me to the best chippy in Edinburgh to have the Scottish delicacy of deep-fried Mars bars. And one bite was enough to persuade me that you're all mad.
Wonderful. Great. Well, thank you for that. Now we have some time for questions, and there's Linda's wandering around with a mic. Would anyone like to ask Deirdre a question arising from the lecture? Oh, chap at the back there.
Yeah, hold on for the microphone so it comes into the people hearing it.
Okay. Thank you very much for your talk. I found it very interesting. I'm just wondering about the mechanism of diffusing Adam Smith's values. Do you see Adam Smith as sort of the progenitor of this value that you say is the cause of this modern world, or is it that he's representative of these important ideas and therefore should be read as a great example of these modern values that have made us all rich instead of peasants?
Yeah, that's right. Look, the seed can fall on infertile ground, and there were seeds before. The school of Salamanca in Spain, monks saying Smithian things in the 16th century. Osaka in Japan had merchant academies in the late 17th century that sound remarkably Smithian. And from time to time you get Smithian type urging of equality. Of course, there's this thin line of John Ball, the defrocked priest in the peasant revolt, 1380 in England, who said was drawn and quartered for saying, when Adam delved and Eve span, who then was the gentleman? So there's this thin line of equality of permission, but you could say, and it's a deep question of the history of ideas and their connection with the real economy, whether it was because the ground was fertile or because the seed was cast. I mean, look, there were other people like this. David Hume, for instance. Not too many, though.
Questions?
Thanks, Professor, for a model of clarity, and you've made me very happy to work in Glasgow, I have to say, so thanks very much for that. My question is...
As long as you don't make me eat deep-fried Mars bars.
Never touched them myself. I wonder if you could expand a little. You touched on a fundamental economic idea that scarcity is a defining element of how we understand and how we work with economics. I just wonder, in the spirit of applying Smith's ideas to our contemporary world, whether scarcity is still actually as important, given the arguments for a post-scarcity culture.
Well, yeah, I have a colleague, Marian Amtupi, at Cato, and he, surprisingly, he's a man, speaks of superabundance. And that's the kind of world, to be really realistic about it, we work in. To buy a clothes washing machine 40 years ago cost you 2 weeks of labor. Now it costs you a few days of labor. So, okay, things can get better and are when you don't have a war or over intervention by the state or whatever to stop it. And there's another sense in which scarcity, which that's what we talk about in economics, that's what we teach. It's easy to teach. And I'm very much in favor of supply and demand curves, what he used to call at the University of Chicago, price theory. Not so much theorem proving, but supply and demand and then applying it to actual circumstances. And that works for the short run. But for the long run, as the great economist Israel Kirzner put it, the actual idea is to find ways of doing things better that don't have a big opportunity cost. And Israel cannot be accused of not understanding opportunity cost or scarcity. He certainly does. But he's making the point, as I make in my books about the Great Enrichment, that the Great Enrichment came from mind-blowing novelties, again, little and big. So we've got to stop teaching scarcity alone. Because then we think that modern economic growth is understood with what is bizarrely called growth theory in economics. My former colleague, who died a few days ago, Bob Lucas, was insistent on this, as on many other things that he shouldn't have been insistent about. And it's a deep scientific problem that we don't focus on the causes of human creativity, because it's the releasing of human creativity that the Scottish Enlightenment in general and Adam Smith in particular were about. And that was the great success. So as long as we keep thinking that, the way forward for, here's a contemporary example. I forget the jargon, I'm going to forget the jargon, but the equalizing of expenditures by the UK government in different parts, what's it called, leveling up? Yeah, leveling up. We're going to spend as much in the Northeast as we're spending in London on public projects. If it's a good idea to have a large population of Geordies, then that should go on. If there's this poignant, there's South Wales is the classic example. South Wales, in the days of the ironstone and coal mining, the valleys, how green was my valley, disappeared. There's a wonderful, poignant song, which I cannot find again. I wish someone would tell me if they know in the audience, about leaving the valleys for London or the United States. But if they hadn't left the valleys and had just stayed there, and the idea was we'll put more money in the valleys to keep them going, that's to subsidize places, not people. One point, that's the scarcity point. I'm an economist, I keep getting back to scarcity. But the real question is what are the tools the government has, and I wish they wouldn't think they had so many, to create a creative economy. That's what makes us rich. It doesn't necessarily make us happy. This happiness stuff I've written on this is kind of silly. God doesn't guarantee us happiness in this life, only eternal salvation if you're an Anglican.
Great. Questions? Oh, got one down here.
I'm sorry to make fun of the Geordies. I admire them very much, especially how they talk.
Thank you, Deirdre, for a wonderful and engaging lecture. And my question, I mean, you make the case for Smith as a strong egalitarian, let's put it in that way, and we have the beautiful passage of the street poet and the philosopher, and
right.
I completely agree. You make the contrast with Jefferson and many founding fathers. And this persuasive idea of equal permission and the idea of permission, as you talk about liberty also, I mean, it's equality, liberty, the liberal plan is equality, liberty, and justice.
Yep.
You could see permission in two ways. One would be your own liberty to pursue or to follow your own projects. But on the other hand, the idea of permission, which is a kind of somebody or something has to allow you, probably it relates to justice, I mean, to the rule of law. Would you agree with that point?
I agree, and that's a very nice way of saying it, dear. That's the trick. This is very helpful because, as you said, permission is sort of, I'm going to give you permission to do what you want, dear. Here you are. And what we should think of it as each of us giving permission to each of us, of all of us. As far as my nose, you're free to shake your arm around as much as you want, as long as it's right up to my nose. So it's the equality of permission then, as you said, becomes the rule of law, the rule of a just law, by the way, not the rule of Erdogan in Turkey. It's a just law that we care about, and justice then defined as equality of permission. So that's worth looking closer into, because I think we get confused by keeping reverting to equality of opportunity. Oh, and one more point. I believe, and I think I've tried to show it in my books, that equality of permission leads to these other equalities. Not perfect. Low, time and chance, happiness to us all. But the best we can do in a world of scarcity, in a world of where we can't, there's no tree of abundance that we just pluck things from.
Great. I think we've got one here. Robbie at the back. White shirt.
Thank you, Professor McCloskey. I would like to go back to your point on, if I read this correctly, the wealth our nation doesn't necessarily found upon the exploitation of other countries or economies. I would like to push that back a little bit, since the history of slavery exploitation has created this huge discrepancy in a lot of conditions such as health, human capital, and so on and so forth, that doesn't necessarily allow for the liberty or the equality of permission, which is the precondition of the prosperity that we are talking about. So I wonder how you will respond to this potential inequality of permission due to this extended history, like this broad history of exploitation and inequality.
Well, I once believed that, so I can sympathize with your position. When I was a kid, I was a Marxist. I don't, if you don't want to be called a Marxist, I don't mind. Call yourself something else. Actually, my first my first politics was Prince Peter Kropotkin, the anarchist. But I don't believe the story that exploitation made us better off. Equality of permission is possible anywhere. The attempts in India to soften at least the horrible system of castes is a case in point. If a non-Brahmin can become the premier of India, distressing as he is in some ways, that's a step in the right direction. If slavery were the cause of our enrichment in the West, why isn't the Middle East rich? East African slavery, the Arab-run enslavement from the coast up to into the Middle East, was longer and as large as West African enslavement into mainly Brazil, and then secondarily the Caribbean, and in a definitely tertiary amounts into the United States. If slavery were the cause, Egypt would have become the home of the Great Enrichment, or Brazil, for that matter, none of which happened. Indeed, the main beneficiaries of slavery were not the Europeans, contrary to what you might think. It was the African specialists in violence who seized other black people and sold them to the white people. The rents from being such a person in Africa were very high. And more generally, the history of humankind, as Gibbon put it, is merely the history of the crimes and horrors, I forget his exact phrase. We've been exploiting people since the beginning. Women, for example, have always been exploited. And is there anyone here who was not born of woman? I take it not. So if we're going to explain enrichment from exploitation, why didn't the whole world, actually it's on its way to happening, but why didn't the whole world become rich? So I think the whole argument, I've written on this, that I've written on it, by the way, is not meant to end the discussion that Deirdre has written on it, therefore it must be true. No, that's I don't even accord St. Paul that degree of respect. But I simply mention it to establish that I've thought about it some, and I haven't done original research, other people have. But slavery isn't it. Exploitation of the working class is not it. So that whole argument on the left, which by the way then feeds into the argument on the right, because the idea is the original accumulation of capital then is investment, which then makes us rich. But I've already told you that investment didn't make us rich. Investment's necessary, but so is the existence of a labor force. So is the existence of rainfall. So is the existence of the universe. There are an infinite number of necessary conditions for the enrichment we've had in the last 2 centuries, this astounding, completely unprecedented enrichment. So there has to be something peculiar about the 18th century. This is one of the many reasons I don't go along with an argument of some of my colleagues that it's Christianity that caused the Great Enrichment. Well, why not in the year 1000? Why not in Russia? Why not among the Coptic Egyptians? Come on. And then there's this weird hypothesis, capital W-E-I-R-D. This is amateur economic history. It's ridiculous. And its basic problem is timing. If weirdness, it's awfully close to whiteness. And I really don't believe that being melanin challenged, as the majority of people in this room are, that's what I call it, melanin challenge. You don't have enough melanin. Or the ancient Germanic tribes in the Black Forest. All this kind of crazy Eurocentrism is not what caused. What did cause it, you might say, is namely, but also Holland. Holland is an important part of the story. Is this idea that's I can't overemphasize how weird to use the word, the idea that people were equal and should be given equal permission is in the 18th century. People laughed at it. English leveler, Richard Rumbold, was executed in St. Albans. Was it St. Albans or Edinburgh? Anyway, he was executed in 1685 for offending the regime of James II. And in English law, I think it is English, if I've got it right, is it St. Albans or was it? No, it was in Edinburgh that he was executed, so it was Scottish law. But in any case, you're allowed to make a speech from your scaffold. And he said, I think there is no man born of God superior to another, for none comes into the world with a saddle on his back, nor any booted and spurred to ride him. Now that egalitarianism, they probably laughed at Edinburgh when he said that. This silly man, he thinks that people are equal. By 1785, more people believed it. By 1985, the most tyrannous countries in the world were claiming it without enforcing it. So my claim this afternoon is that ideas, as Keynes said, John Maynard Keynes said, when all is said and done, ideas run the world. This is against my youthful Marxism, in which ideas are superstructure and froth on the great material waves of history.
Okay. We've got time for one more question. Robbie, if you've got the mic.
Thank you. I'll try to be as quick as possible. Fascinating just how many...
Hold it closer to your mouth, dear. Think of rock music. Put it very close to your mouth and it'll...
Right, don't worry. What I'm thinking about, where does the equality of permission come from? And you've already started talking about Scotland in the 17th century, so I'm going to suggest that actually from that movement we're starting to see a belief in equality of moral capability.
I can't hear you, dear.
Equality of moral capability. And that then leads to...
Equality of what?
Moral capability.
Moral capability,
yes,
yeah.
That we are all able to be moral, autonomous beings, and that then leads into, underpins the Enlightenment.
Well, I think that's plausible and interesting.
Okay, so what I'd like to ask you to finish off with, perhaps to bring back to your the book you've written, what would an economic exegesis of the parable of the talents look like?
Yeah. Well, for those of you who don't know the parable of the talents, the basic message is invest. Don't just allow the money to sit there in the ground or under the bed. Invest. It's an example of, among many, I've actually counted them, of the alleged parables of Jesus. You know, the amount that actually from the mouth of Jesus is small and dubious. But anyway, it's one of the numerous cases in which the historical Jesus used prudential arguments to point upward. He's not your investment advisor. It's the kingdom of God that matters. This thing's dying. There we go. Oh, no, it's off again. Turn it on. There you go. But there is, I think, a theological change that happens. And I'd let you know much more about it than I do, about the situation in Scotland on this score. But there is a theological change which says, well, there's a quietism or an acceptance of your place in life. You're blind and crippled, and you're condemned to sit by the west gate and beg for your life. Don't worry, dear, you're going to go to heaven. Right? Stop whining. Take up your cross. That's a definitely Christian attitude, but it tends to break down in the late 17th century and 18th century. And modern Christians are much more likely to say, oh, no, we've got to help the poor. Because it's an implication of this first view that you don't need to help the poor. They're already on their way to heaven. Don't worry. Worry about your own wealth. And so there's I think there's a shifting of the theological ground in the 18th century. But I've written an entire book called, what's it called? Bourgeois Equality, which is a historical, literary, sociological answer to the question where this equality of bad girl, not opportunity, equality of permission came from. And I think it's got other causes than that. For example, it's not the Protestant ethic. Max Weber is incorrect and didn't understand Benjamin Franklin among his many mistakes, but it's a great book. One of the great books of the 20th century, Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. It's all wrong. It's all mistaken. But what he did get right is that ideas matter, and that ideas matter. That's the core of my argument here. So theology matters, but what mattered in the Reformation was not Calvinism, was not Knox, but equality of church governance. The flattening of the hierarchy in the church, it gave people the notion that they could take care of their own salvation, thank you very much. Extreme example of this are the English Quakers from the 1740s on. You should go to a Quaker meeting, it's very enlightening. You sit there There's no minister. There's no ceremony. You just sit there and wait for someone to feel the Spirit, the Holy Spirit descending on them. And if they talk about their grocery list, well, that must be the Holy Spirit speaking.
Okay, thank you very much, Deirdre. I'm afraid we'll have to draw this wonderful conversation to a close. And what a great way to start the series with the call that ideas matter, and that's exactly what we're about here. So some academic workshops here tomorrow, and also Professor Sarangas Deaton will give a talk in the evening. But for the moment, I'd like you all to join me in thanking Professor Deirdre McCloskey for starting us off.
Thank you all very much.
This is some little Adam Smith type
stuff. Adam Smith stuff. The blessed man himself. Thank you, dear. Adam Smith's schlock. What's this? I'll show you some of